Good afternoon, Julia. Welcome to TwiceTold.
Thank you for having me, today and having this conversation. I'm really excited to talk about the book.
Wonderful. I'd like to start off by introducing you to the concept behind TwiceTold. So, TwiceTold is an exchange between author and reader where both of us sit across from a table and revisit the book. You from the perspective of having written it, I from my perspective of having read it the first time. Each of us, hopefully, we walk back with some bit insight that we didn't have before. I know it will be true for me, and I hope it would be true for you.
For sure, for sure.
So the idea behind Twice Told is that the book was told the first time was when it came into print. Up until then, you had imaginations of it. You had variations in your mind, you had variations on your computer. You thought of a different tangent perhaps when you were writing this. And your editor must have given it their own draft, their own spin. But it was told when it came into print, where it could not be edited any further. Now it's out there for public consumption. I read this book and with my own baggage and biases and thoughts and books that I've consumed before. So I interpreted it through that lens. Now, I'd like to either confirm those observations or get them corrected. That's the objective today. And hopefully, this also serves as an ode to you for 10 years of your work that have gone into this slim book. But such a wealth of stories that you've gathered. Some of them are Some of them touch your heart, others make you wonder just how resilient is the human species. So, thank you for authoring this book.
Oh, thank you for reading it and engaging it, with such, a sort of like sympathetic and receptive perspective. I mean, talking about like stories of resilience, that's also exactly how we describe a lot of the stories that kind of populate the pages of the book. So I think we're already on the same page.
Superb. So, my first question is going to be, how did this book come about?
Great. So, um, I'm trained as a historian of modern South Asia. And, when I was working on my PhD and then writing my first book, I was also really, focused on working as a legal historian. So my
Yeah.
first book is about Islamic law in the Indian subcontinent. And because of the nature, the way in which law is structured in South Asia, sort of from the 19th century onwards, if you work on Islamic law, a lot of what you're working on is cases of involving marriage and inheritance. And I particularly loved inheritance disputes. And so for the work on my first book, I had read a lot of inheritance disputes. And when I came to thinking about a second book, I kind of thought, okay, like I want to work with these materials. But over time, I realized, like, yes, I'm interested in the division of property, but what was really captivating me about these inheritance cases were the family stories that kind of lay behind the disputes, and that I wasn't just interested in how families pass legacies, material legacies like property from generation to generation, but how they pass all sorts of things, whether that be like heirlooms and objects, but also sort of memories and kind of different habits, that might be passed from a kind of grandmother to a mother to a daughter. And so I think this book really kind of, comes into being because of my own kind of deep interest in family histories, how families engage in legacy making, and the ways in which, I my academic training is as a historian of modern South Asia. But in my personal life, I also wrote this book during a period in which I married into a diasporic Indian family who traced their roots to Kerala. I have a 6 year old, so I'm having a daughter in the context of, bringing together like two families with very different heritages. So I think also that experience of being, not biologically, but through marriage, part of a diasporic South Asian family also like really animated my work on the book. I like to say that this is really a book of written from a daughter-in-law's perspective, which is both kind of inside and outside of the family history at the same time.
I guess this gives the expression this is a work of love so much more depth and meaning, your book, that is.
Thank you. Yeah, that's definitely true. You know, both kind of my own love for my family and then kind of bringing that same sense of compassion, but occasionally also irritation to like working with all of these other families that populate the pages of the book. You know, I think you know, I'm interested in intimacy in all of its complexity, which can sometimes be, you know, gentle and loving, and at other times can be intimacy can also be kind of like violent and filled with tension. And I want to kind of bring, you know, the full complexity of like what constitutes like family in all of its different forms, not just its kind of biological or legal forms, but all the different ways in which we kind of form kinship, you know, to the book.
Understood. You mentioned that you had recurring nightmares while writing this book. Would you like to walk us through that?
Yes, right to the sort of, you know, midnight hauntings that kind of I think do play a really like important role in this book. So, you know, as I said, I'm trained as a historian. I've worked in archives for decades now. But I found that with this book, where I was both working in archives and I was actively reaching out, meeting with, and having conversations with families, the descendants of the people I was encountering in archives, it really changed my experience of engaging with the past. And I think through the feelings of responsibility and indebtedness that first emerged through my conversations with people sharing their own family history with me, then I started to go into the archives and the kind of boundary between what I owed to the living and what I owed to the dead really blurred for me. And in general, most historians and archives once someone's dead, people generally think of themselves as free to write whatever they want about that person. And we have a responsibility, you know, to tell the truth about the past and to be rigorous in our archival research. But we don't, like professionally, we're not trained to have the same sense of kind of, you know, the ethics of concern for the privacy of people is generally thought to be different for the living and the dead. And questions of consent, you have to ask living subjects for their consent before you write about them. But you don't have to do that for the dead. But then, you know, as I was working with both, I started to really be haunted by the idea of, you know, do the dead want me to write these stories about them? And obviously, I have not yet, you know, mastered the kind of art of bringing the dead back or engaging in seances, but I did find myself very much waking up in the middle of the night and wondering, you know, would John By want me to write this about her? You know, the things that I know about her, that's a character in one of the characters in the chapters of the book. You know, I learned a lot about her by looking at these inheritance disputes that she had to battle with her stepsons. You know, would she want me to have written about that? I don't know. And they're kind of unanswerable questions, but I think there's a kind of a productive work done by kind of just asking those questions that we can't necessarily answer and kind of sitting with this question of what do we owe to the dead. I don't necessarily think we always should tell their stories exactly the way they would have wanted them told because as historians, we have an obligation to many different people, to the many different dead, to the many different members of the family, and to our readers to tell them, you know, to give them an account of the past that is accurate. And it's sort of that process of weighing those responsibilities to different people that I think, you know, was something I struggled with a lot in the book. And I don't feel like I came up with perfect solutions to all of those ethical dilemmas, but the solution I did come up with is to be as transparent as possible about them in my writing and not to hide that the struggles I had with some of those questions.
Understood. On a funny side note, I mean, I could imagine Janbai, the litigious Janbai, filing a petition against you, a writ perhaps calling you to court, although she's dead, but she is now filing a case against you for defamation and seeking damages and reparation. That could be a
I
sto that could be a plot for a horror film, a very legalistic horror film.
Well, actually, her grandson, who is Farouk Topan, who is a both an academic as well as a writer of Swahili fiction. At one point, we were kind of talking about, oh, we should really write a play together about Jambai. So we were also kind of envisioning her coming back from the dead, and she was a very litigious and also often quite quarrelsome woman. So I'm sure it would both be a stressful encounter, but also a very interesting one. I will say I'm not sure I would like to face John By in court, but I would find it a very stimulating experience. I'm sure.
Such as life. Unfortunately, we can't have her. But my next question would be about the history of indentured labor, especially British, especially in the British colonies.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the history of indenture forms a really big part of the book. So I'll kind of step back for a moment and say that the number of Indians in the kind of long 19th century, from about the middle of the 19th century through the first couple of decades of the 20th century, the number of Indians who migrate under formal contracts of indenture is about 1 to 2 million. But several tens of thousands more Indians sort of migrate during this period. So the population of migrants who are formally indentured is, less than 10%. So it's a really important part of the story of South Asian migration in the Age of Empire, but it's by no means the whole story. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to tell histories of indenture alongside other types of migration of traders, migration of people who might have traveled as like students. I even like, I don't write a ton about it, but I got interested in people who migrated as part of circuses, during this same period. But I think the reason that histories of indenture are particularly important is it is kind of a particularly exaggerated version of the broader history of migration during the Age of Empire, which is that these are technically free migrations, but they happen in a kind of often semi-coerced context. So I'll step back and say sort of in 1833, the British abolished slavery in the British Empire for the most part. And so from the 1830s onwards, in places, for example, in the Caribbean, which had relied really heavily on enslaved African labor, they are faced with labor shortages. And they turn to Asia as a potential source for recruiting, new populations of labor. But because formal slavery has become so stigmatized within Britain, they have to find new methods to basically what they would call recruit, what we might call coerce people into, migrating to work in these really brutal conditions of labor. And so they come up with this system of indenture in which people basically sign contracts in which they agree to work on plantations in distant places, for a specified period of time, often for about 5 years, although in some cases people found themselves having to renew contracts over and over again. And because people technically sign that contract, or in many cases put their thumbprint on that contract, the British describe that as free migration. But what we know as historians is that often the people who enter into those contracts of indenture, they're fleeing really desperate conditions within India. So as the British incorporate India into global economies, farmers in Indian villages are exposed to much more extreme boom bust cycles, in which in some years, they might actually make a decent income from growing certain crops to sell on global markets. In other years, because of a collapse in prices or because of, their crops fail, suddenly they have nothing to eat because they're only growing one crop. They're only growing cotton or they're only growing indigo, and they don't really have like the crops they need to sustain their own like their own lives. And in those cases, those people basically, in some cases, find their ways to recruiters who are recruiting indentured laborers to migrate abroad. So, some people say, oh, many of these people were kidnapped, and that may have occasionally happened. But I think the bigger story is the way in which sort of the economic conditions that the British produce in India create kind of coerced consent into these kind of exploitative labor arrangements.
Understood. Now, am I do I remember this correct about some of the indentured laborers being told about chili trees that grew gold? Were these some of the stories that were told to them to entice them to leave their villages behind?
Yeah, so I think there was definitely, many of the recruiters are actually Indians, but they're incentivized. So I mean, these practices still exist today. Like you're basically either like, forced or, you get a certain cut of the profit to kind of go and get other people to buy certain things or to agree to certain arrangements. And so, part of the sort of process would be that you would kind of go into villages and you would present the migration experience in the best light possible in order to meet your quota of however many laborers you were responsible for recruiting. So within families, there are definitely stories that are told about, the kind of legends that were kind of sold to people who to get them to sign these contracts versus the realities they encountered on plantations. But I was also interested to hear within families, stories about my great grandfather was a really adventurous, 18-year-old, and he wanted to see the world. And like he signed onto this contract of indenture. So, one of the reasons I want to present the story of indenture in, I think, its real complexity, which is that there were a few cases, occasionally people were kidnapped. Some of the time I think people were fooled into these arrangements, but other times I think people were living in like pretty poor conditions and they were exercising their own agency to try to make new lives for themselves. And I don't want to suppress the agency altogether of people who I think in some cases were really brave and were really trying to kind of, find new possibilities both for themselves and, I think there are a lot of people who did this because they wanted to be able to send money back to their families, which is a story that I think resonates with the present conditions of labor migration from South Asia today as well.
Understood. Now, these indentured laborers, once they moved into these foreign colonies, how did they view themselves with respect to their nationality? Were they still Indian, or were they now Fiji or South African, or whatever those nations may be?
So it's a really good and I think really important question. And I'd say, one of the characteristics of my book is that I'm not trying to tell a singular story of like a particular population. I really take an approach of centering the experiences of particular individuals and individuals within kind of like the constellation of their family relations. And so, what the story that emerges out of my book about these questions of belonging is one in which many of the subjects which came to kind of center in the pages of my book are people who had a really uneasy relationship with these categories of nationality. And I talk about in the book, a particular like contemporary figure in these discussions, Esha Pillai, who kind of talks about, I don't feel fully comfortable describing myself as Indian Fijian, and she uses this phrase that is very evocative for me. I am diaspora. She kind of particularly eloquently articulated something that I found in talking with many other families, which is not to say, I mean, many of them felt some kind of attachment to India. Many put down like significant roots in the places where their ancestors migrated, but also many of these families moved many times, not just once. They moved from India to what we would now call South Africa, and then they move onwards to the Gulf. Some of these families in some cases have considered returning to India, or they move onward to Singapore or the US or Canada. And in telling those stories of migration across generation, I think it really complicates this picture of assimilation, which is like so dominant still in a lot of the literature on migration. And I think also the relationship to India is complicated by the fact that many of their ancestors left India at a time in which it looked really different than it does today. Their ancestors may have left what we would now call Pakistan or Bangladesh, and so their ability to kind of easily inhabit those national categories, I think, is sort of challenged by their own experiences. And when you look across families, also the presence of people like me who are kind of in this orbit but can't easily be kind of described as Indian, and if we take that to be a kind of like ethnic category. And I think that's not at all the only story of belonging that you can tell about diaspora, but I found it a really interesting story. And so it's the story I kind of narrate in the book through the kind of particular experiences of the people and families that kind of captured my imagination.
Understood. Now, teasing out one particular individual from the many that you've detailed, one gentleman, Tambusami Pillai, his life seems to stand out in every aspect. Why, not just his life, also his death. Could you tell us why was it that his life was so markedly different, even not just as diaspora, but even among the diaspora, his life and his death stood out. So how and why is that?
So this is again where, as a historian, I'm really drawn to good stories, and good stories are often about people who, on the one hand, reflect something about larger historical trends, but also have a kind of particularity that makes them really idiosyncratic. And I'd say in the case of Tamuswami Pillai, he is a very important like merchant. So he's born in Singapore. He gets a really great education. He starts to work in a law firm in Singapore. Then his boss takes him from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur. His boss happens to be an influential British colonial official. So Tamaswamy becomes involved in the emerging colonial administration in Kuala Lumpur. And then having built all of these relationships, he then kind of, goes out on his own and he becomes a business person, and he becomes really instrumental in building the kind of infrastructure which becomes like modern KL and modern Malaysia eventually, more broadly. And his is not a story of, we were talking about indentured labor. He's not an indentured laborer. He actually recruits people to work as laborers. So he's like the boss. And so on the one hand, his is a story of sort of great privilege. But then there's also, I think, other aspects of his story that are really, sort of unexpected, although I think not as unusual as one might actually think. So, one of the things that actually caught my attention about Tamuswamy is that I was interested in graveyards actually in Singapore and in KL. And I read this account of his funeral in which he dies in Singapore. His body is put on a boat and it's transported from Singapore to KL. And then he is like probably the most prominent Hindu at the time in KL, but his body is not burned, it's buried. And so I actually went to KL trying to find his grave. And, from a modern perspective, we might not have expect an observant Hindu to be buried rather than cremated. But in the context of the diaspora, that was actually very common. And in the early 20th century, cremation facilities were still, pretty scarce, and people sort of, have to kind of adapt to what is available. Tamaswamy actually could have been cremated. By the time he passes away, there are some beginning to be cremation facilities in KL. And so in his case, I think it was a choice, and I think it reflected the kind of really disparate communities in which he was part of, not just part of the Tamil community, not just a kind of the Hindu community, but he had business relationships with Europeans, with Chinese merchants in KL. And my search for Tamuswami's grave also kind of led me to the many women in his life who also, have complex stories that don't easily kind of conform to this stereotype of Hindu Tamil. And so looking for his grave and the kind of puzzle of where to find his grave. I won't tell you whether or not I found it. I'll leave that for people to read in the book. But also, why was he buried rather than burned? Also, kind of lead me unexpectedly to some extent to kind of like learn more about the women in his lives. And all of that together kind of tells a story about being diasporic, which really doesn't fit in the box that people traditionally put him in, which is that this kind of patriarch of the kind of Tamil Hindu diaspora. So I think on the one hand, I was drawn to him because he was a remarkable character, but at the end of the day, I think that story of the ways in which people who are part of these diasporic migrations kind of trouble like ethnic or religious categories is actually a really common experience that kind of resonates across many of the stories I tell in the book.
Understood. Now, moving on to Janbai. Could you tell us about Janbai before? What do we know about her before her marriage to Tarya Topan?
So, typically John Bai is described as the wife of Tarya Topan, who is kind of, Tarya Topan is a kind of similar figure to Tamuswabi in that he's seen as like, the architect of sort of trade between Western India and Eastern Africa. And the family, if you go to Zanzibar, you'll see pictures of Tarya Topan all over the place. If you kind of look in the footnotes of some of the histories to Tarya Topan, you'll see reference to his third wife, Jambai, who when he is sort of, already like, fully on in middle age, he marries a younger woman after his first two wives have passed away. And before her marriage to Tari Topin, we don't know very much about Jambai. We know that she was the daughter of a much less wealthy merchant, but she sort of enters into the archives. And in this case, I'm working particularly with the family history. It's only when Tarya Topan's like elder sons are kind of looking for a new wife for their father that we start to kind of meet John By. But in the chapter in the book, I really try to resist the tendency to tell the story of John By as the story of Tarya Topin's wife, and to really kind of think about how do we tell her story in its own right, which is also, it's clearly we can't tell it without talking about Tarya Topan. And there's sort of parts of her story that we just don't have access to because it's not just that it's not in the official records, but even her family didn't know that much about her life before she was married. I mean, quite remarkably, in that chapter, I include a photograph of John By, which I actually found in the collection of the Peabody Essex Museum in Salem, Massachusetts. I was also working with her grandson, and he told me when I showed him that photograph that he'd actually never seen a photograph of his grandmother. So, whether we're working in official, colonial records or within materials that have been collected by families, it is striking the ways in which women's stories can fall out of both of those different types of archives. And, what I do in the book is to try to turn to quite kind of different collections, in this case, a museum collection. I just happened to find like a photograph and a bracelet that had been made their way from Zanzibar to Salem, Massachusetts because of her relationships with other women. And I really try to use those sources as a way to kind of tell a history of a woman, who had been forgotten not only by like the colonial archive, but to some extent also by her family, or the extent to which her family remembered her. It was as this really like quarrelsome, difficult younger wife. And I think while that was probably to some extent true, she's a much more complex character than that. And I think she was really, really savvy in her own right, and to a considerable degree, like responsible for the wealth and influence her family amassed.
Understood. Now, is Janbai getting this bad rap because she was quarrelsome and a difficult woman, or is it because the woman is standing by on her own, fighting for her rights, and she's claiming to stake her own space? Is that the reason why there's so much negative publicity about her?
I think so. I think, Taria Toban was clearly really fond of his third wife, and he, specifically sets aside certain properties for her. There's also descriptions in various records that he really trusted her, and he asked her advice when he was engaging in various sort of commercial dealings. And the kind of version of her as kind of troublesome and quarrelsome really kind of emerges out of the narratives more produced by her stepsons and to some extent her own sons as well, because she'd actually take her own sons to court, and she ended up like litigating cases with her own sons. And I think this is a kind of testament to the way in which she wasn't willing to be fully kind of assumed within the structure of a patriarchal family, and she was also pursuing her own interests. And for a woman in the early 20th century, in almost any part of the world, if you were kind of pursuing your own interests, many men would write you off as, troublesome because you were troubling the patriarchy. And I think, that is, you're absolutely like right to kind of, I think we have to read against the grain of the family narrative as well. Historians are often told to read against the grain of like state and official archives, but in that story, I also try to read against the grain of certain types of images of Jambai that had been passed down within her own family.
Understood. Now, speaking about Natal, was this the only province in Empire where settlers, non-white settlers, were prohibited from purchasing or actively settling into the region?
No, so really the story in Natal, which, is part of South Africa, is part of a much wider story in which parts of the British Empire that are sometimes referred to as white settler colonies, colonies where there were large populations of people who came over from Britain and not only worked as colonial officials, but also, bought land, built farms, owned property. These white settler colonies, which includes not only South Africa, but also Australia, New Zealand, Canada, in many cases, in many ways, the US, although it's an early exit from the British Empire, also fits the model of a white settler colony. They, over the course of the late 19th and early 20th century, put in place increasing bars to Asian migrants. So, on the one hand, at various points, these colonies actually try to recruit Asian labor to do, specific things, whether it's to work on plantations or to, mine gold in California. When there's an acute economic need, they bring in Asian labor. But as soon as that economic need is reduced, they want to get rid of the Asian labor because they see it as potentially competing with, white businesses and white property owners. And so all of these regimes are put in place to only very selectively allow in Asian laborers, and whenever the colony perceives them as not needed anymore, to try to kind of push them out. And so South Africa and the types of racial policies that are put in place, really are part of a wider kind of history of Asian exclusion and its sort of relationship to the construction of certain places as really dominant white societies. And so, we know the kind of history of apartheid in South Africa, but I think it's important to actually, realize the ways in which many places that maybe don't have as bad a rap are also kind of implicated in these histories of Asian exclusion.
Understood. So now settlers such as Pungavanam in Natal, were they, how was she allowed to initially purchase property and at a later date with the institutionalization of apartheid, how was she formally forbidden from holding property and how was she disinherited or how was her claim contested?
Yeah, so the story kind of I tell in the chapter about Natal includes kind of a constellation of both kind of men and women who come over under contracts of indenture. So Pungavenam is actually like one of the men in that family. Unga Amma is like the woman whose story I tell, and so. For a period of time, a certain segment of indentured laborers who were able to be relatively successful. Often they'll work a term of indenture, then they'll be promoted into a more supervisorial role within a plantation. And in some cases, they'll be able to save enough capital to kind of buy a house or to buy a small plot of property. Then they may actually start to employ other Indians as, laborers on their own property. And that there are a handful of formerly indentured Indians who become very successful and very wealthy in South Africa. But what happens under apartheid is that the apartheid regime puts in place racialized restrictions on who can own property in certain places, who can live in certain places, and the best property and the best neighborhoods are reserved exclusively for people who are identified as white. So what happens in the case of Pungavenam and Anga Amma's family, as I would kind of learn through later connecting with the family, is that they both amassed a lot of property, but then under apartheid, a lot of that property they were forced out of. And so it is a complex history both of possession and dispossession that unfolds in their case.
Was this matter ever discussed or deliberated or even argued in court? Because given that Pungavanam has legally purchased his property, he is not a squatter. He has deeds of deeds to show for land acquisition. So how is it that by English common law he could be now disenfranchised? So were there any debates or arguments happening in the public sphere?
Yeah, so I mean, for my own protection, I will not like comment on the legality of any like particular case, but I will say when I went into archives and was doing research in South Africa, I encountered a lot of people who are researching family history for precisely this reason. And a lot of this land is now contested, and the kind of unraveling of property regimes that were constructed under apartheid is still very much an ongoing process because to a considerable extent, white people in South Africa who amassed property under apartheid, many of them still own a lot of property. And so the kind of change in government has not always translated to a change in economic relations. And that is something that is very much still being contested on the ground. And often like research on family history is very much entangled in like ongoing litigation over land. And I am interested in that as an economic relationship, but I'm also interested in the way in which land gets kind of imbricated with emotion and with kind of questions of legacy that really do go beyond just a question of kind of like, you know, pure capital. And that's something I explore in that chapter is how this sort of long history of possession and dispossession kind of creates what I call a kind of unsettled relationship with colonialism among the kind of Indian diaspora in South Africa, many of whom now are actually no longer in South Africa. So again, it's not just a story of India and South Africa, it's also a kind of global story and how some of those things might then continue to like have unexpected kind of ramifications for the new lives they build in other places as well, whether that be, Canada or the Gulf.
Understood. Now, return to Janbai. Do you see any commonalities between Janbai and English Mary?
So it's a really interesting question. So English Mary is what Anga Amma, what her descendants came to call her was a sort of nickname. And in the book, people can read more about sort of, I try to unpack why this woman who came over from Madras like comes to be called English Mary by her descendants. But I'll say kind of I was fascinated by the question of like, what similarity could we see between Jambai, who's the wife in a very wealthy, like merchant trading firm, and English Mary, who is comes over as part of like an indentured labor migration. She's orphaned as a little girl on a plantation in Natal. And seemingly from a class perspective, like these two women's stories are completely different. But I think partially because I was also trying to think about like what is my relationship to these two women. One of the things I did come to kind of imagine is that both of them experience being women on ships. And in the case of John By, she cares for young children on ships. Actually, one of the daughters in her family passes away while they're on a ship, and they actually have to bury her at a like midpoint in their journey. Whereas Unga Amma comes over and actually would have witnessed, I know from the record, she would have witnessed people passing away on the ship, and then she actually like loses her little sister and her mother on the plantation. And sort of the commonality that women might have faced in terms of the caregiving labor, having to do that like while traveling. It was something I could also in my own way identify with, because at one point while I was working on this book, I didn't actually have, at various points I had my daughter with me when I was doing the research for the book, but at one point I was actually breastfeeding and I wasn't traveling with her, and I was having to like pump milk, and I got to like a security check and they wanted to like test my milk for explosives. And I'm just thinking like even today it's so hard to be a mother and to travel, and I feel like that is an experience across like time and class and different identities, that is something maybe many of us can connect with, which is not to say that our experiences are the same, but that I think my own experience of being a mother allowed me to kind of imagine aspects of their experience in new ways. And so that's the way in which I try not just to write a history of women, but I still remain really committed to the kind of innovative moves that can come from really centering women's place in the past.
Understood. Understood. Now, moving on from men to women to men, speaking about this interesting gentleman, Jan Muhammad, or should I call him pronounce his name the German way, Jan Muhammad. So, are
Um,
there parallels between him and Bhagat Singh Thind?
yeah, so John, Jan slash possibly John, John. And whether that was one person or two people is the subject of one of the chapters of a book. And this is a person or people who sort of left traces in the archive as a seaman, as a religious lecturer, as a traveling salesman. I'm sort of trying to untangle like various aspects of that story. But one kind of facet of his or their story is that John Ali Muhammad in 1925 is part of a legal case in which he is trying to defend his citizenship. So in 1923, Bhagat Singh Thind is part of a case that goes before the Supreme Court in which he has naturalized as a U.S. citizen, and his citizenship is challenged, and the Supreme Court sort of declares his citizenship illegal on the logic that he had applied for citizenship as a white person, arguing that being Aryan was being white. And the Supreme Court at that time rejected that argument and said that Indians were not white and therefore not eligible for citizenship. Now, it's really interesting that John Ali Muhammad shows up in court in 1925 trying to defend his Indian citizenship. Or sorry, his U.S. citizenship. And he does it in that case, trying to argue that because he is, by that point, he's converted to Christianity, but he is of Muslim origin. And through his ancestral ties to Arabia and to the Prophet, he tries to make an alternative argument to being white. but the courts also reject his argument. So despite kind of making that argument in two different ways, Bhagat Singh Thind and John Ali Mohammed end up pretty much in the same place, which is that at that point in U.S. history, the who qualifies as white is being defined in a narrow way and in a way deliberately to exclude Indian Americans, kind of placing them within longer patterns of exclusion, which had long been applied to Chinese Americans, but which are being applied with increased rigor to Indian Americans in the 1920s. And as I kind of allude to in the book, probably in part because the British are putting pressure on the U.S. to police and exclude sort of mobile Indians who the British perceive as kind of instigators in the kind of global anti-colonial fight against the British Empire.
Understood. Now, speaking about digital communities such as Gulf history or what Gulf Asia, sorry, and Brown history. So, what has been your experience with them when it comes to curated memory keeping? How much of memory keeping actually includes active memory exclusion? What do they choose to put up is also determined by a rationale or logic.
Yeah, so I think it was before we turned on the recording, but I was sort of saying in around 2020 during the pandemic, I started to spend more time on Instagram like many other people did. I was very busy, but somehow also like, found myself, doom scrolling. But not just doom scrolling. I actually found during that period in 2021 that some really interesting things were happening online. And Brown history is much old is quite a bit older than that, but there was more engagement. And I think for a period of time, um, Instagram was really opening up new conversations about histories of the South Asian diaspora, both through accounts like Brown History, which does that at a global scale. And then I really found this account, Gulf South Asia, particularly interesting because it's trying to, explore that history in particular in the ways that it kind of intersects with the geographies of the Gulf and South Asia. And those accounts were centering family photographs, they were incorporating oral histories, and I think they were telling like many different stories about diaspora. I mean, one of the things I find really interesting about Brown history is that it brings together histories of migration that occur around partition with histories of migration that are about kind of more like global migrations. And it both looks at north-south migration and south-south migration. And Gulf South Asia really like centers south-south migration. And so a lot of like mainstream histories of migration are about one-way journeys from the global south to the global north. And both these accounts are telling like much more complex histories about migration and mobility, and in some cases also return journeys. So I interviewed a bunch of the people who contributed to Gulf South Asia, and many of them spent their childhoods in the Gulf, but now are based in India. And I'd ask them, or they would tell me, I don't even know if I'm diasporic. And so the way in which like only certain forms of being diasporic have been foregrounded in, both like historical scholarship, but also to some extent in the popular imagination. And I think these accounts are really kind of unsettling that in productive ways. But by the time I did some of these interviews in 2023, people were already telling me that their content was being buried by certain algorithms on the platform because particularly Gulf South Asia, it wasn't profit oriented in any way. That kind of content Instagram was really not interested in promoting, and it became harder and harder to engage in those sorts of projects on a medium like Instagram, which is fundamentally profit seeking. And so I also want to be realistic about the limitations of certain forms of social media to doing this kind of creative work. They are ultimately owned and operated by like, trillion-dollar businesses that are not like interested in serving the public as we know. But then I think, your point that these platforms also foreground certain histories and marginalize others. I mean, an area that I don't talk a lot about in the book, but I'm interested in exploring more in later work is what histories of caste can and cannot be told in platforms like Brown History or Gulf South Asia. And I think, histories of caste are in the diaspora are an area where we still need a lot more scholarship. And they're issues that are becoming more and more pressing in kind of the contemporary discussions of the diaspora, the South Asian diaspora in the US. And I think some of those discussions are kind of floundering for lack of a more substantial kind of historical basis on which to have that conversation. So that wasn't something I felt like I could really dig into in the book. I'm first and foremost trained as a scholar of Islam in South Asia. So, even though Muslims obviously have caste, like writing and working on caste was not something where I had a lot of background. And so I don't do it a lot in the book, but it's something as I started to finish the book, I kind of felt was like, I wish I could have done more with. And in future work, I would like to kind of think more about, what happens with caste in the diaspora, because I think it's both, a complex but very important question.
Understood. My last question is going to be, what is it that the diaspora can teach us about being kind and compassionate human beings?
So we started with kind of our kind of mutual sense that like the stories in the book are about stories, a lot of stories of human suffering, but also of human resilience. And I think, I walk away from this work, there are a lot of moments of cruelty, but also with kind of a deep sense of, how remarkable people are. But I'd also say that, this is a book that has a connection to South Asia, to India. But a lot of the stories of migration that I tell, I think resonate with experience of migration in many, many different contexts. And I'd say at this current moment in which certain political forces are trying to tell us that there's like a right way to migrate and there's a wrong way to migrate, I think my book really shows that when you dig into the history, no one really like can migrate without tangling with the law. And I think about like my own grandmother came over to the US, and stories in our family are that my great grandparents lied about how old she was in order to get a cheaper passage. Does that make her an illegal migrant? Does that mean that my citizenship should be called into question because her paperwork wasn't entirely true? Well, I can tell you as a historian, if you look at the paperwork people have filled out to move from one place to another, almost everyone's paperwork has something about it that isn't totally like, true. And I think that, that digging into the history really shows us that that kind of divide between migrating in the right way and the wrong way doesn't hold up to history, and that, our shared experiences of migration should really create compassion for everybody. And so I think, in terms of the big takeaway, which I think is what you're asking with your question, is that I think we should really resist political rhetoric, which is trying to pit one group of migrants against other groups of migrants. We're all migrants and we share that common history.
Absolutely. As this old Hindi or Persian couplet goes, हमाम में हम सब नंगे हैं.
Well put. Thank you for such a wide-ranging conversation that shows just the care with which you read the book. It's, a great honor as an author to have a reader like yourself. So, I'm hugely appreciative.
Thank you for authoring this work of love, Julia. This was humbling, at times irritating, at times curious. A whole mixture of feelings swept through me, and I see the kind of effort you put in. This is a work of art, Julia. Thank you for authoring this book.
No, thank you for having me.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.
Sounds good. Bye.
Bye bye.